Hi, I'm Jim Ryan, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the UVA Democracy Biennial, where we'll explore some of the most pressing challenges confronting democracy in America and around the world. We're doing this by bringing together political leaders, policymakers, journalists, scholars, philanthropists, and private sector leaders to share ideas and to challenge assumptions. Most importantly, we'll have the chance to engage with a wide variety of ideas about how to make democracy work for all of us. I hope and trust you'll find these conversations enlightening and thought-provoking. UVA is a perfect place to host these conversations, in part because we've been at this for quite some time. Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia in 1819 with the mission of educating citizen leaders who would contribute to what was then a very young American democracy. Our university has grown and thankfully become much more diverse since that time, but that founding purpose still animates us today, some 200 years later. UVA exists, in short, to serve the greater good and to serve our democracy in particular. That premise led us to create the Presidential Ideas Festival back in 2019 to inspire and rejuvenate nonpartisan conversations about the American presidency with the hope of future events to follow. Since then, a tumultuous presidential election, a global pandemic, and devastating natural disasters have brought democracy and our most trusted democratic institutions into question once again. In some ways, this may be the most urgent moment for democracy we've faced, certainly in our lifetimes. Yet I see reasons for optimism that our democracy will not only endure, but thrive. The founding of the Karsh Institute of Democracy is one of those reasons. With this institute, our hope is that UVA will become a world leader in the study, teaching, and promotion of democracy. It will enable our world-class faculty from across the university who are experts on democracy to collaborate in new ways and to accomplish more together than they could on their own. It will become a central hub for debate and dialogue on issues of national importance. It will help UVA to become deeply engaged in public outreach, focused on everyday ways that citizens can participate. It will be an indispensable resource for policymakers and leaders, and it will serve as a nonpartisan catalyst for action that will ultimately help to strengthen democracy in the United States and around the world. American democracy is not guaranteed indefinitely. All of us must ask ourselves what we can do to foster democratic culture and democratic institutions. That is, what we can do to serve. I know that the terrific speakers you'll hear from today will inspire you to do just that. I'm grateful to all the departments, units, and centers that have come together from across the university to be part of the Karsh Institute and to host the biennial, especially the Miller Center and the Democracy Initiative, who produced today's event. I'd also like to thank the sponsors that made the UVA Democracy Biennial possible: the George and Judy Marcus Democracy Praxis Fund, John and Dathel Georges, Tom and Jenny Beecher, David R. Good, Verizon, and VPM. This event would not be possible without your support. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Risa Goluboff, Dean of the University of Virginia School of Law. In that capacity, I am honored to have established the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy at the Law School in 2018. And the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy is one of the close collaborators with the Karsh Institute of Democracy that President Ryan just spoke of, and an institutional co-sponsor of today's event. I'm also a legal historian who has spent much of my academic career studying and teaching about civil rights and constitutional law, past and present. As a result, I am particularly delighted to be a part of this portion of this year's UVA Democracy Biennial. Our first speaker today is Karen Lips, who will explore gender equality from a conservative perspective. How can we best achieve gender equality? Should we prioritize access to opportunity or outcomes? What are the potential policy implications of the answers to those questions? Karen is the founder and president of the Network of Enlightened Women, an educational and networking organization for conservative women on campus and early in their careers. Karen is also the editor of She's Conservative: Stories of Trials and Triumphs on America's College Campuses. She is what we call here a double who, a 2009 graduate of the UVA Law School, as well as a graduate of the university. Karen practiced law at Wiley-Ryan for several years and was a spring 2016 resident fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics. She is a contributor to the Washington Examiner and has had editorials published in the Washington Post, Time Ideas, Politico, National Review Online, Fox News, The Atlantic, the Boston Herald, the News and Observer, and many other outlets. She has been named in the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy, and in 2010 was awarded a William F. Buckley Award from the Young Conservatives Coalition for her work in leading the network of enlightened women. It is my pleasure to introduce Karen to you today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing her pre-recorded remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. In 2021, women have achieved so much. Consider the milestones for women we have been witnessing in government. A woman is now vice president. More women than ever are serving in Congress, thanks in part to a double-digit increase in newly elected Republican women in the House. Justice Amy Coney Barrett became the 5th woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court and is the first mother of school-age children to do so. Last year, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ratification and certification of the 19th Amendment. Let's take a moment and consider the life girls were born into 100 years ago. For an American girl born in 1920, her average life expectancy was 57 years. Women made up just 20% of the labor force, and women were far less likely to attend college than men, and earning 34% of bachelor's degrees. Compare those numbers to today. The life expectancy for a girl born in America in 2018 is 81. In 2020, women made up 46% of the labor force in the US. And this year, women are projected to earn 57.7% of bachelor's degrees. American women today overall have opportunities that most of our grandmothers could only have dreamed of. We owe these opportunities in part to feminists who broke down barriers. After all, women didn't always have the right to vote or own property. The question we must answer now is, how can we carry forward their legacy by further expanding opportunity for girls and women in America and around the world? The answer is by advancing a new version of feminism, opportunity feminism, that seeks to maximize freedom and opportunity for women to build the lives they want to build. In 2021, despite the great progress that has been made, some women do not have the basic opportunities that many of us take for granted. Consider education, for example. Every child, including every girl, should have access to a high-quality education. Around the world, many girls do not have the basic opportunity to go to school. An estimated 130 million school-aged girls are out of school. This has dire consequences for many of them. Even in the US, girls from lower income households often have fewer opportunities in K through 12 education, in part because for many, their only real option is to attend a school based on their residence and zip code. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, in 2019, 57% of American 12th grade girls scored below proficient levels in reading. The American K through 12 public school system too often exacerbates inequality. Our current system isn't working. We must advocate for education reform to make sure girls have access to a quality education, which for many might not be traditional public schools. Girls shouldn't just have the chance to get a high quality education. They should be empowered to make their own decisions about marriage. Around the world, 19% of women aged 20 to 24 years old were married before age 18. In the US, only 6 states have completely banned child marriages, those under 18. Between 2000 and 2015, more than 200,000 minors were married in the US. Alarmingly, the US immigration system even encourages child marriages. A bipartisan Senate investigation found that thousands of child brides were being brought into the US to marry due to a loophole in federal law. Policymakers should review laws to prohibit girls from being forced to marry during their childhood. This policy change will ensure girls have the opportunity to grow up and mature before making the life-defining decision of marriage. Also, girls should be safe from female genital mutilation, the practice of removing or cutting the external genitalia on girls and young women without a medical purpose. 200 million girls and women alive today living in 30 countries have undergone FGM. The CDC has warned that more than 500,000 women and girls in the US were at risk or had suffered from FGM in 2012. Women should come together and address this and prevent women and girls from being subjugated to FGM. Women should have the opportunity to live their lives without having gone through that. And when it comes to women in the US workforce, we must tear down barriers to entry and re-entry to give women an opportunity to find a job and earn a living that works for their lives. In many states, workers, and particularly women, face limited employment opportunities due to state occupational licensing rules or state-based requirements to practice. While sometimes these requirements protect the public health and safety, many times they seem to be used as tools to limit competition. Occupational licensing is increasingly common, today covering nearly 30% of the US workforce, up from 5% in the 1950s. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey signed into a law that made the Grand Canyon State the nation's first to broadly recognize occupational licenses from other states. But Arizona's step is not enough. Unnecessary occupational licensing requirements should be repealed so that women have the chance to find work, including those women who move states frequently. As to how work is framed, government policy should not tip the scale to full-time, in-person jobs for everyone. According to a Pew study, a majority of moms, for example, don't prefer full-time work. We should advocate for policies that make it easier, not more difficult or costly, for employers to set up flexible work arrangements and rehire women who've left the workforce for a time. Companies like IBM and Goldman Sachs offer return to work programs to help professionals rejoin the workforce. Boeing has a return flight program for people with technical degrees. These are the type of issues I hope that are areas on which modern American women can all agree. Girls and women should have the opportunity to receive a high quality education, choose who and when they marry, avoid sexual violence, and pursue the employment setup they want. I'm confident there's other issues out there where we could find a broad common ground in favor of expanding women's opportunities. But too often, the conversations about politics, and particularly feminism in politics, focus instead on areas of disagreement. A tragedy of modern feminism is that the women's movement has been captured by narrow American domestic policy and politics. As a result of our current political climate, many women don't even feel they have the opportunity to voice their political opinion. In 2018, the Network of Enlightened Women, the group I founded while I was a student at the University of Virginia and now run, published our first book, She's Conservative: Stories of Trials and Triumphs on America's College Campuses. This book shares the stories of 22 young women and what it's like to be a conservative on campus. One key takeaway from the book is that a lot of these women decided individually before they even stepped foot on campus to keep their political views private, not just because they were worried about their grades, but because they were worried about the social pressure. They felt an unnamed pressure to stay silent for fear of negative consequences, both in the classroom and in their social lives. The closed-minded, partisan nature of modern American feminism has led to a divisive movement that tears anyone down who doesn't agree. Instead of telling women what is acceptable to think, a truly empowering women's movement would celebrate women who disagree about policy in a civil manner. To truly make progress for women, American women should join together in support of a new wave of feminism, opportunity feminism, that focuses on expanding freedom and opportunity for all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Terry, Executive Director of the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at the University of Virginia, where since 1931, we've been providing public impact research and leadership training to communities and institutions across the Commonwealth. Center teams like the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership and the Virginia Institute of Government have been cornerstones in our quest to build stronger democratic practices for individuals and organizations throughout Virginia. And this has become increasingly important over the past year as we recently launched our strategic plan, Reimagining Public Service, where we've placed an emphasis on building thriving, equitable communities. I've also been fortunate to serve on the Virginia State Crime Commission since 2020 and have worked diligently with a committed group of public servants who are intent on examining our criminal justice institutions and bringing about necessary policy reforms to create a more fair, just, and humane system. This is a responsibility I'm honored to be a part of, and I'm hopeful that the hard work put in by so many to create a more equitable society will benefit us all. Our next speaker, Rashad Robinson, who will speak about inequality, mobility, and democracy, is important for us to reflect on during these times. Given the values that serve as the foundation of our constitutional democracy, civil rights work that aims to address inequality both historically and as it has impacted marginalized communities today is important for us to elevate in our public discourse, much like we're doing today. Rashad is the president of Color of Change, the nation's largest racial justice organization that focuses on building resources that strengthen the political voice and real power for Black communities. Before joining Color of Change in 2011, Rashad was a member of the inaugural cohort of Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity and served as a senior director of media programs at GLAAD. He's appeared in hundreds of news stories, interviews, and political discussions through outlets including ABC, BET, CNN, MSNBC, OWN, the New York Times, Fast Company, and NPR. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, LA Times, Newsday, Huffington Post, among many others. We're honored to have Rashad to join us today. Rashad, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Larry, and to everyone at UVA for bringing us together for this conversation. And what I hope will be both challenging and most importantly in these type of conversations, honest. I'm gonna take a second to bring up some slides and take us through what I have to say today. So I wanna start off by saying that democracy, mobility, and inequality, all of these words are just different ways of describing people's lives, different realities people live in it or are forced to live in. They are exciting words, but they aren't innovative concepts. They are not just catchphrase fads for philanthropy or frames for thinking or work from think tank fellows to spin a story around. They are not principles and they are not process. Behind these words are people. People either living in freedom or being denied freedom. And these words should tell us, if we're honest about how we use them, what level of freedom different people are living in and how much suffering people are in, and who is responsible for causing that suffering and ending that suffering. And the conversation around them should also be able to tell us whether Black people, for instance, have less all-around freedom in society than other people do, and what to do about that. There are those who think that freedom means being able to refuse the offer or mandate of a life-saving vaccine. And there are those who think that freedom means getting access to it in the first place. They feel they've reached mobility, or at least our society has moved forward if they can freely reject it, or on the other hand, if they can freely access it. Whichever freedom is top of mind for you probably correlates to what is top of mind for you when you think about words like democracy, or when you hear words like racism. Democracy in particular is not just a word that measures racial justice. Racial justice is also a solution, a driver for major improvement in our democracy itself. Because the movement for racial justice has sacrificed more in the fight for democracy, died more, and contributed more to expanding the principles and practices of democracy than any other. Black people are democracy's pioneers in all the ways that we have invented fighting for it, improving it, and yes, using it. And if it feels like a new and useful way of looking at democracy and a new way of looking at Black people, then let's talk about that more together. And if we do, we might get to a different place together. You know, democracy is also about rules. The rules about how we make rules and for what we do when those rules are ignored. We know that disasters from Hurricane Katrina in 2005 to COVID in 2020 show the different rules that exist in a society, that there are different rules for different people. We can see that play out in these two cases representative of hundreds more. Does democracy help defeat racial hierarchy in society or reinforce it? And that's a good test for how we're doing. While someone who grows up in a white supremacist environment will believe that college is free, college being free for all Black people, while white people have to pay for it, a story I've actually heard. We know that the truth of the rules is quite the opposite. Most rules in society still make life harder and less free for Black people and for other people of color in almost every aspect of life. And despite the rules set in place trying to sort of have the opposite effect. You know, and this is what we need to have an honest conversation about when it comes to democracy. And that's what I want to try to do with this short talk. Because I don't see the benefit in giving ourselves permission to have an abstract conversation or a dishonest conversation, as if we are talking idly about the environment while forests burn, or talking about the pros and cons of healthcare as a right when we are seeing hundreds of thousands of people die, and not from having the right to just, and while not having the right to an equitable and just healthcare. Dying from a particular approach to COVID, from the Sacklers OxyContin, from their approach to pharmaceuticals, from McDonald's and other particulars approach to marketing. It's not honest to say, or to force our teachers to say, that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. The actual factual documented record says it was. It is not honest to talk about democracy if, for some, it isn't about the same ideology being used as a tool for advancing a reality of permanent subordination and racial hierarchy. The fights we are having over democracy can either take us out of that or take us back to that ideology. And it depends on the outcome of the democracy struggle that's burning right in front of us right now. And it depends on the choices all of us make here in conversations like this. What we choose to argue with and attack, and what and who we choose to ignore and give a pass to. It's a choice that is up to us, but only if we choose to have an honest conversation about what's happening. And by the way, the stats aren't going to help us here, because the stats are like books that are on a shelf that is not sturdy. They are as sturdy as those unsturdy shelves. So let's keep talking about the big picture before we get to the stats. And so I talk a lot about the difference between presence and power, that getting your issue on the front page of the newspaper isn't the same as getting your issue on a bill that passes Congress, that getting talked about a lot by a lot of influencers online doesn't necessarily mean that you actually have influence with actual decision makers. Presence doesn't automatically translate into power, even if marched by hundreds of thousands of people, even everyone chanting your demands, even everyone cheering for your team. This is one of the most important strategic concepts to understand when fighting for major social change. And I usually talk about it in the context of racial justice as a norm in society, the work to make justice real. But it applies here today. And on this specific topic, with this specific mix of people gathered today in a very different way, because we have to step back and understand if this conversation is about presence or is this conversation about power? Are we trying to build up the power of people who believe in democracy, or are we somehow, by pretending to talk about this topic reasonably in a truly unreasonable time, merely contributing to a level of presence of this conversation in elite circles that actually works against the power we need to ensure the country remains a democracy? We cannot sit here and pretend that all people in power today, or maybe even all people at this conference today, actually believe in democracy, a system in which all people of age have one equally representative vote in choosing their political leaders. To pretend that all believe in that and that our disagreements are merely about how to get there. Because right now, as we talk, there are hundreds of elected leaders in this country who are working to make sure we don't get there. And thousands of media professionals, media opportunists, corporate executives, think tank and advocacy leaders, donors that are helping them do it. And you know, what makes democracy powerful is the power of the people who believe in it and their willingness to fight for it. Economic mobility, inequality, the threat or abuse of public resources, the commons, and the constant swindles that have taken opportunities away from people and steal away wealth and well-being from people, especially Black people, are really all completely different issues if we're talking about a democracy or we're talking about something else. If we're talking about a country in which a minority rules a majority, well, that's another kind of government system, and it requires a different kind of response. But if we're talking about a real democracy, then we know how to solve these challenges through democratic means. And we know that solving these problems actually strengthens our democracy and yields the best results for the widest number and largest number of people. The question is do we believe in democracy? Or do we think that just some people should vote and not others? Or that some people's votes should count more or not at all, even if it's a representative republic? And if we believe in it and are making the people who can protect it, expand it more powerful, so if we believe in it, the question is are we making the people who can protect it, expand it, more powerful or less powerful? Are we making them more powerful even if they're not on our team? And even if making them more powerful means we might lose out on some other stuff. Black people have had to live at the mercy of not getting what we want, always seeing other people's concerns and welfares put before our own and having to live with that. For generations, for longer than most white people have even been in this country, Black people have been told that there is a higher common interest at play, that our sacrifices were needed in order to move the country forward. I think maybe it's time that there are others that need to understand that they might not be able to get everything they want, but that there's a higher common interest at play, that it's their turn to sacrifice something, to not get their way in service of our country's democratic aspirations. So when we have this conversation, we have to ask, given the history of this country, if you are an influencer in some way in the political conversation or over our political reality, and you are not doing everything you possibly can to make sure that every Black person who wants to vote is able to vote and is fairly represented in government, then exactly which part of American history are you standing for? And which part of the aspirations of America are you advancing or defending? Because when one party thinks that they can win by throwing out the votes or voters of the other party, that's a dangerous level of competition bordering on a monopoly. The kind of monopoly or the company town days that the kind of monopoly can destroy, that kind of monopoly can destroy an economy. But when one party thinks they can best win or only win when they attack the votes of Black people and attack Black voters, and that's no longer competition waged out of control. That's structural racism. That's white supremacy. And you simply cannot truly believe in democracy and support white supremacy at the same time. You cannot say one thing and then do another, whether it is someone who runs an entire state or runs a media company or works at a think tank or picks fights over words of pro-democracy advocates across the street while putting up no meaningful fight at all as their deeply anti-democratic family members run wild and burn down their own house. And if you are using these words to reduce the number of Black people voting or being represented in government, then the only honest thing that can be said is that you are part of taking us backwards. You know, people are smart. They know that if you are not talking about a full democracy, you're not really talking about a democracy at all. You're talking about another kind of system that you actually believe in. Why is it that when we hear talk of elder fraud and it happening at the level of billions of dollars, that is not seen as political? But when Black people are targeted by any number of predators out there, all of a sudden people have trouble caring about a specific group of people as being abused and defrauded. Are we seriously going to make voting a two-sides issue? One with one side being a legitimate strategy to prevent masses of people to voting or having their votes counted or whatever else. I'm here to talk about democracy. But if we don't have the honesty, the level of honesty to actually talk about it in real ways, then we are just speeding up the inevitability of destroying it. You know, I want to end by saying that, you know, Black people are doing so much work all around the country and allies are doing so much around the country. The question is what are people here doing? I'm going to appeal to the white people here. What are the white folks in the audience doing? Are you going to continue to make excuses if you are, or acknowledge the injustice in the reality and then go about the work to doing it? Let me tell you what Black people are doing about it. We are working to change the rules of democracy so our society actually becomes stronger, a stronger democracy, and actually delivers on the principles of freedom that everyone is always talking about. And there is legislation supporting that, and media that supports that, and rallies that support that, and leaders far and wide who are supporting that and working towards it. And we are hardly alone. We know that racial justice is what the majority of this country believes in. Just like COVID was a test for so many about what really matters to them in life, we know that this current upending of democracy is a current attempt to throw it out and replace it with something else, is a crisis that is helping millions of people realize what matters to them and what is really worth fighting for. And that's the higher purpose they truly want to be part of. If Black people can still believe in democracy, all of us can. And I invite you all into this conversation, an honest conversation about doing the work that we can all be heard, counted, and visible, regardless of whether we are privileged or vulnerable, in the majority of the minority, or in favor or out of favor with whoever may currently be in power. That is the work ahead, to translate the presence of these conversations into the power to change the rules, and to do the honest work of moving our country forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Your remarks and the earlier presentation by Karen Lips helped to set the stage very well for our next conversation. I am Ian Solomon, Dean of the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy here at the University of Virginia, and it is my privilege to introduce this afternoon's panel discussion. I trust that all of us are familiar with the metaphor used by Martin Luther King Jr. about the promissory note, the check signed by the architects of American democracy, a promise that all people would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Martin Luther King argued that America had given its Black citizens a bad check, a check which had come back marked insufficient funds. And he said, "We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation." Well, this afternoon for the Democracy Biennial, we have an extraordinary panel that can help us to audit the Bank of Justice, can help us understand the promise of American democracy and the continuing viability of the American dream. And we have terrific experts for this discussion. The first is Robert Doar, president of the American Enterprise Institute and an authority on anti-poverty policies and safety net programs. Robert joined AEI in 2014 after serving for more than 20 years in leadership positions in the social service programs for New York. In the time since Robert joined, AEI has become one of the leading voices on the significance of work and family circumstances in human flourishing. Our next panelist is Ai-jen Poo. Ai-jen is the co-founder and executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, an organization dedicated to bringing dignity and fairness to domestic workers, the majority of whom are immigrants and women of color. Ai-jen was also a leading voice in the women's movement. In 2019, Ai-jen co-founded Supermajority, a new home for women's activism, training, and mobilizing for gender equity. Our next panelist, David Rubenstein. David is the co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group. His professional and philanthropic accomplishments are vast, including his compelling book about leadership called How to Lead, and his most recent book, The American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream. One thing to highlight is how David has personally protected many of the early original copies of the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta, in order to preserve and display them for public benefit. Our next panelist is Margaret Spellings. Margaret is the president and CEO of Texas 2036, which focuses on building long-term data-driven strategies to secure continued prosperity ahead of the Texas bicentennial. She was the Secretary of Education in the George W. Bush administration, and most recently served as the president of the University of the North Carolina system. Our moderator will be the extraordinary Melody Barnes, Executive Director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy and co-director of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. She is also the J. Wilson Newman Professor of Governance at the Miller Center and is a distinguished fellow at the UVA School of Law. Melody is also a former colleague of mine from the Obama administration, and I'm very happy to be working with her again here at UVA. Over to you, Melody.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your extraordinary work and for that wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled that you're here with us for a timely conversation about the American dream and how and whether it is achievable. You know, today, the American dream, and the way we talk about it, often connotes a materially abundant life. You know, it's owning a car and a house. It's being able to send your children to college while finding your way to a restful retirement. And just last year, about 54% of American adults thought the dream was attainable. While there are variations across racial groups and generations, overall, Americans still believe that they can attain a better life than the one into which they were born. The question is that true? A Vox article from earlier this year noted that mobility prospects are grim today. From that article, millennials are the first generation predicted to be worse off than their parents. A 2017 study found that a staggering 90% of children born in 1940 earned more than their parents did when they were 30 years old. But for children born in 1984, that percentage declined to just over 50%. We must also ask ourselves if we're defining the American dream too narrowly. At the height of the Great Depression, historian James Adams coined the phrase American dream in his book, The Epic of America. And he wrote about more than material affluence. He said that men and women should be able to attain, quote, the fullest stature of which they are innately capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. Does that moral imperative implicit in Adams's conception of the American dream and the possibility of economic security have meaning in the lives of Americans today and into the future? What does it really mean for those on both sides of our borders? Can we build a stronger, more reliable ladder for economic and social mobility? And if so, how can we do that? Those are some of the questions we must ask ourselves as we assess the status of the American dream. And I'm going to leave it to the distinguished panelists that Ian just introduced to help us consider the answers to those questions. So again, I'm thrilled to be with you all. And I want to start out by coming to you, David, and talking a little bit more about this phrase, the American dream. The promise and the pursuit of the American dream are powerful elements in the American story. But how has the American dream been embedded in the American narrative and intertwined with democracy? And I guess the even bigger question, is the American dream real? Your thoughts on that?
Well, an interesting phenomenon is the American dream. One would think that all civilization from the beginning of time parents would have wanted their children to have a better life than they did. But there's something about the way society developed over thousands of years that people really lived in the caste and the social class that they were born in. It was America that trying to change that. When people came to this country, and because we didn't have a large social class before and a lot of wealth, people thought that if they worked hard, they could work their way to the top. And James Adams, as you mentioned, described this as the American dream. It is interesting that we don't have something called the French dream, the British dream, the Czech dream, the Russian dream. Why is it America, we uniquely call this out the American dream? It's because here, more than any other country in the world, the idea that people could rise up from their modest circumstances and get to the top through achievement and hard work is something that's part of our ethos. Sadly, though, the American dream is now believed more by immigrants to this country than people often born in this country. We now have 46 million immigrants in this country, more immigrants than live in any other country in the world. Why do so many immigrants want to come to this country? Because they believe in the American dream. And very often the people who come to this country are ambitious, hardworking, and they actually do rise up in many circumstances throughout our society. You see immigrants at top level positions. Many people who are born in social and poor economic strata in this country have given up on the American dream, in my view. Sure, there's always going to be somebody that rises up, and there are always going to be some people that we talk about, but more and more people in the bottom economic and social strata, because of racial or other reasons, seem to be accepting the notion that they can't rise up. And maybe there's a reason why they can't rise up. We have a high degree of barriers for people to rise up in this society right now. So I think the American dream is challenged right now, but the challenge is so much so that it's really people who live in this country, born in this country, who actually, I don't think, accept the idea of the American dream as much as people who don't live here, who want to come here. And it's a sad situation. We can talk later about why the American dream has fallen down to some extent from where it once existed. Though I should say, when the American dream, when first conceived of, there were many barriers as well. And it wasn't as if racial barriers didn't exist in 1931 when the phrase was coined. They're much worse then. But now I think we have higher expectations of what people should be able to achieve with their lives. And the higher expectations are being, I think, thwarted to a large extent by factors we'll talk about in a moment.
So thanks, David. I'm wondering if others want to jump in and talk about this idea as to whether or not the American dream is real. Karen and Rashad talked about this from different perspectives. And I'm wondering if others of you have a reaction to that, given the work that you do on the ground, the work that you've done over time.
Well, Melody, I'll weigh in quickly and say that it's about the quality of education and the rationing of rigor and the rationing of resources that we often see in our public schools. I'll talk about Texas in a minute, but we in Texas have gone from the mid-30s to the low 40s because we've stopped paying attention to what we call in education those achievement gaps. Human capital is the name of the game, and David's absolutely right. While our expectations have gone up, the needs of our economy have increased, and so high levels of education are the number one answer to achieving the American dream, in my view.
I think it depends on your vantage point, because just thinking about the women that I work with and understanding the history of the work of domestic work, for example, in this country, it's the work that takes place inside of our homes, the caregiving, the cleaning work that is enabling of much other work in the economy. But it's always been associated with work that women do, and as a profession with women of color, and has always been devalued. And so for generations, this work has been poverty wage work, and there hasn't been much mobility for this workforce. And there is a degree to which one generation can do better than the next, but I would say that the reality is that this workforce and the women who do this work are working incredibly hard decade after decade and still living in poverty. And so I do think it depends on the vantage point where you sit inside of our economic system, and race factors into where you sit inside of our economic system as well. And so I think the question of whether the American dream exists, I think the idea of it does. And I think it's becoming more and more elusive to more and more groups of people. And it has been elusive for many throughout the history of this country.
Yeah, yeah, the striving, but not necessarily the attainment. Robert, is there anything that you want to say to this? Because I also want to turn to you. Aijen raised the topic, the issue of poverty, and I want to turn to you with that in a second. But
yeah, so first, thanks very much for including me in this great discussion and letting me join this distinguished group of panelists. I have worked on issues concerning poverty alleviation and helping people get a start through a combination of employment and earnings that come from employment and government supports that make work go further. And I think we've made a lot of progress in reducing the poverty rates for children and for all Americans in the country. And I think most people on both sides politically agree that over the last 25 years, we've done that. And I worry that if we keep thinking that that's the number one problem and not turn to this one concerning mobility and upward mobility and being able to make the American dream real for people who both want to work and also move further up safely into the middle class through the acquisition of skills, greater human capital, greater economic development, greater economic activity that allows that kind of growth to take place. And I think the challenges to make that happen and the issues that need to be addressed to make that happen are different than the ones we worked on to get people up to above the starting line, up above the poverty line. And I sometimes worry that we confuse the two issues. They are different. Relieving and reducing poverty in the United States is an important topic. We're not there yet. We have more to do. But this problem of upward mobility really is the challenge for those of us who care about these issues. It's the one we should really be focusing on. And I think it's very connected to the American dream and to this topic for this conversation today.
Great, and I want to come back to the mobility question, both in a second, both terms of economic mobility as well as social mobility. I know there's a question from the audience about expanding this idea of the American dream such that we're talking about both economic issues, but we're also talking about a more prosperous and fulfilling life. So I want to come back to that in a second, but Robert, maybe kind of starting with those who are at the bottom rung of the economic ladder and issues of poverty, because I think even for people who believe in the dream, people recognize that poverty is real. And I'm curious if you could tell us in 2021, how you think that we're doing with that issue before we talk more about how do we move up.
Yeah, I think we're doing a lot better than we give ourselves credit for. And when you look at the poverty measure properly, using both adding in all of the supports we provide through government properly and appropriately through SNAP or public health insurance or the earned income tax credit, and seeing
you mentioned
food stamps. And to me, if we look at that correctly, we really have made great progress in relieving the material hardship of Americans compared to an historical standard that's increased for inflation. And I think all of us deserve some credit for that, including, and most importantly, the people we're trying to help, because to a large extent, especially in the period after welfare reform, households with mothers and fathers went into the labor force in a way that they had not in the past. And they leveraged those earnings from the labor force with other government supports to improve their situation. Now, they're not safely in the middle class. They still struggle. They still face hardships. And from my perspective, there isn't enough upward mobility for themselves and their children. But I think the way to tackle that issue is with things like better schools, greater opportunities in education, adult education, better community colleges, not necessarily applying the same solutions that we did to get families above the poverty line to this more difficult challenge, but really more pressing right now. So yeah, I think fairly looked at, and I think that scholars on both sides would acknowledge there has been a lot of progress. And I want to have us turn to this new, tougher challenge that helps people move up.
Okay. And Jen, I'm curious if you can build on that a little bit, because Robert mentioned some things that he thinks are critical to addressing and tackling these challenges, the poverty challenge, the mobility challenge. And you've said, I want to read something that you've written. Most of the policies and systems that enable our democracy and our economy to work properly were born of a very different age. I think we need a new framework, and we need to rethink our social contract at its core to be reflective of the realities facing working families today in this country. And I want you to elaborate on that a little bit. What informs your view that we need this new framework, and what's necessary so that we can create greater mobility?
Well, first of all, Melody, it's great to see you. And thank you so much for having me, and being in this conversation is very energizing. So, I think if we take, for example, our nation's labor laws, a set of core foundational labor laws were enacted during the New Deal in the 1930s, along with pieces of our safety net that are very foundational. And that was a moment when we were a manufacturing-based economy, a national and regional-based economy, and we had the employment model, dominant employment model was permanent full-time employment. And what we have today is a situation where we are a service-based economy. Technology is in a completely different place. We are also a globalized economy. And depending on who you ask, some labor economists will tell you it's about 17% of our workforce. Others will say it's closer to 33% of our workforce is what we call non-traditional. So temporary, part-time, self-employed, independent contracted, and fewer people are actually able to benefit from our safety net or the labor laws and protections that were put into place, because more and more of our economy doesn't fit the model that those policies were designed for. Not to mention the fact that our lifespan is on average about almost 20 years longer than it was at that point. People are living longer because of advances in healthcare and technology, which also has huge implications for our safety net, the kind of care that we need, our healthcare system. So that is kind of what informs what I believe to be true, which is that we need to rethink our social protections, our labor protections, our safety net, to include everyone who's working, regardless of how they work, where they work. They should be able to have access to benefits. And if they are working, they should also be able to make ends meet. And I think, that's the implication of this, is that even before there was a pandemic and massive job loss, we had an epidemic of low-wage work in this country, where too many people were working incredibly hard and still not able to pay the bills, still having to choose between paying for food and gas, between paying the phone bill and the electric bill. And so we have to really look at the whole. We have to make sure that work pays. We have to make sure that our safety net actually keeps us all safe, and that our benefit structures are actually accessible to all kinds of working people, no matter how they work.
Aijen, Robert, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Aijen, I'm just wondering, you mentioned some things, making sure that work pays, access to benefits. Are there things that you see out there now that fall in those categories that you would say are working?
Well, I think there are states that are trying to raise the minimum wage, states and localities that are trying to raise the minimum wage. There are, in the pandemic, we actually made some of the relief available to independent contractors and non-traditional workers, which I think is really important. And I think we're in a really unprecedented federal policy conversation right now about investing in our caregiving systems and infrastructure in this country to better support access to childcare, paid leave, and home and community-based services for the growing aging population and the workforce that provides those services actually having living wages with benefits and economic security. So I think we are on the precipice, on the verge of making massive leaps forward if we're able to move forward on this reconciliation, the Build Back Better agenda in Congress.
Okay, and so Aja is referring to this, the $3.5 billion bill that Congress is wrestling with today, sitting beside the infrastructure bill. I noticed, Robert, you look like you want to say something.
Just in the context of the part-time or non-traditional worker, or especially independent contractor, there is an aspect in New York State and New York City and all across the country of our safety net that does allow for benefits and work supports and supplements to wages to flow into those households in a way that does make their situation have greater resources in their household. It's kind of an interesting thing. If you don't work for a traditional employer who requires you to work the full 40 hours and get a full salary or the compensation for the entire year, but instead you work on your own as an independent contractor, you can manage your time in a way that allows you to remain eligible and maximize certain benefits that supplement wages. And that is an aspect of our safety net that I don't think is well understood. It may not be what we want, but our safety net, the people that run the SNAP program or the Earned Income Tax program or other forms of public assistance, including public health insurance, does accommodate workers who work in a non-traditional way or non-full-time way in a way that I don't know that we all recognize. And it has led to reductions in poverty and greater resources for those households.
Let me add a couple of factors that haven't been mentioned so far. One is illiteracy. 14% of the country's adult population is functionally illiterate. They can't read past the 4th grade level. If you're functionally illiterate, you have no chance of really rising up in society, in my view. We have to do a much better job of getting people to learn how to read. Secondly, the high school dropout rate, while it's been improving, it's still about 8% or so, and it's 22nd out of 27 developed countries in terms of high school dropout rates. So our high school dropout rate is pathetic compared to other developed countries. The college dropout rate is also very high here, about 25%. And if people drop out of high school and obviously they drop out of college, that's going to be a problem. We also have too high an incarceration rate. We're incarcerating people at the highest level in the society and in the world. And then when people get out of incarceration, they aren't able to exercise their vote, the right to vote in many cases, or get other kinds of privileges in society. Voting is also something that is a very low percentage in this country relative to what it is in other developed countries. If people are going to have some impact and get greater social benefits, in my view, they've got to vote for those benefits. And many people in minority populations are not voting in the same percentages as they should. On the 3.5 trillion that you mentioned, Melody, people have not really done a very good job of explaining what that's about. It's 3.5 trillion. If that happens, it doesn't appear it's going to happen over 10 years. It's not over 1 year. And all you're doing is you're adding $350 billion a year, which is a lot, to a $6 trillion budget. So you're adding about 5% a year over 10 years. So while it sounds like a lot, the way it's being sold, it makes it sound like a 3.5 trillion is going to come all of a sudden and solve all our problems. It's not going to solve all our problems. 6 trillion wouldn't solve it either. And if it goes to 2 trillion, that's not going to be solving very many problems. But I think we have to do a better job of explaining why people need to get an education. If you don't get educated in this society, you are never going to rise up. And if you can't read, you're going to have no chance of rising up at all.
And David, I know you've also spoken about that, quite frankly, in a very, very personal way, talking about growing up in Baltimore, the work that your parents were doing, the access to education that has allowed you to do the things that you're able to do, to be, you worked in government, you worked in the Carter administration, and now in business and trying to do the same thing for your family as well.
Well, my parents were not college or high school educated. They were literate, but they really didn't spend a lot of time with books and so forth. So literacy was important and reading was important to me. And I just try to do as much as I can to encourage literacy, but also people, I believe you could rise up. I did believe in the American dream. Obviously, I'm white, I'm Jewish. I had some benefits in some sense. It wasn't the same as being having no parents or not having an intact family or being African American and having other kinds of challenges. So I don't want to make myself being a great role model. But on the other hand, I did believe in the American dream. And I just think a lot of people today at the bottom of our society don't believe in the American dream as much as I wish they would. And I do think the people that believe in it, as I said earlier, tend to be people who have immigrated to this country, and in part because they believe in the American dream could happen to them in this country if they got here.
Yeah, and some of the issues that I think Rashad was raising earlier as well. I want to come to you, I mean, related to what you were just saying, David. Margaret, I want to come to you, and there's also a question from the audience related to this, because I think Texas is a really interesting lens through which to look at many of the issues that we've all been talking about. Grappling with issues of education, healthcare, transportation, and a whole range of other issues. And then at the same time, and I firmly put this in the opportunity category, it is one of the most diverse states in the country. And in fact, Houston is the most diverse city in the country, with Dallas not far behind. I think Houston's one and Dallas may be ranked as number 4. And you're at Texas 2036 now, as you said, or as Ian said, introducing you, preparing for the bicentennial of the state. And I'm curious, one, where are you all placing your big bets? As an organization, what are you focusing on that you think will work? And say more about how you are going about doing that work.
Well, thank you, Melody. And I'll start with that. We're trying to put the sensible center together to think long-term about the big things. And, our legislature is meeting in Austin right now, and our governor has put on the emergency call dog leashes and transgender sports and further restrictions of abortion and so forth. We'll leave those things to others, not that they're unimportant to many people, but we are about education, healthcare, justice and safety, infrastructure, natural resources. We're a big state, 29 million people, growing another 10 million. We have been majority minority in our public schools since the 90s. 53% of our students are Hispanic, 12.5% African American, and together representing a little more than 10% of the entire school age population of our nation. So you don't have to say much to Texans to get them talking about themselves, as you know. So one thing that strikes me in this conversation is that we often overlook kind of the interconnected nature of these things. Educated people are healthy people. Educated, healthy people participate in civic democracies. Educated, healthy people who participate create jobs, et cetera. So it's a virtuous cycle. And we often think only in these silos. And why it's so important, I think, and this is going to sound like uber wonkery, but here we are at UVA, that we think in smarter ways about the various actors, the federal level, the state level, our cities, counties, and school districts. And right now, I think there's a lot of tension in those realms about who's the decider, where's the accountability, how the resources are allocated, and what our expectations are of our public systems. Probably the best example of that is Medicaid expansion, where we're in about one of, I think, 10 or so states that have not fully leveraged those federal investments. We have the largest number of uninsured adults and children in Texas. And of course, that's a huge drag on our economy and our ability to keep people working and going to school in productive ways. So I think we have to recognize that the hip bone is connected to the leg bone, both in terms of policy and in terms of levels of government and the like. We're that notwithstanding, we're really bullish on Texas because we're young, we're big, we're diverse, we're growing, and we have a fantastic hand to play. But if we don't get education right, the development of our people, we're going nowhere fast. And I say this with some despair that we have been going the wrong direction in the last 10 years or so in education, for example, in Texas, and why a group like I run was born of that urgency. So sensible center together, thinking long-term about the big things, using tons of data. And that's an important point to help get people out of their corners and onto the facts. And it's an awesome challenge. but we're optimistic that, frankly, the states need to lead the way. If and when we have federal investments, that it'll be a good bit of money over a period of time, as David says, but the decisions and the investments and what happens with those resources will be made at the state and local level. And that's why it's so important that we engage with state and local leaders.
Margaret, just building on that, Tina in our audience was asking the question, what specific education policies are you thinking about? And I know you've got experience across the spectrum. You were education secretary. You also ran a large university system. Where might you be putting your thumb on the scale to say this is something that we want to advance?
So I would say three things. One, reading, literacy. I mean, if you can't read proficiently by the end of the third grade, then, game over almost. That's slightly overstated, but not much. And the good news is we know what to do. We know how to teach little children to read. Sadly, we don't do it enough. We don't do it often enough. Our teacher preparation programs and our universities are often not engaging those most effective strategies that help little children learn to read. So reading. And we've seen some encouraging things in places like Mississippi, who've really channeled and harnessed those research-based practices and are seeing good gains. Frankly, to the detriment of Texas and the good of Mississippi. That's why accountability and measurement are important. So early reading. Secondly, we need to put our money where our mouths are around things that we say. We say we want more people with a workforce related credential, but what we pay a lot of money for in our public higher ed systems and no offense, UVA, are professional programs, graduate programs, and so on. And so we need to really channel into those work-based credentials and put our money where our mouths are. So linking funding incentives into our systems, reading and workforce-related credentials like analytics, like coding, like health, like education, that are valuable, job-ready credentials.
And yes, Aijen.
Just want to add one point in here, which is that I couldn't agree more on the importance, the fundamental and essential nature of education here. I think one thing I want to throw in the mix, though, is I do believe that there's so much conversation about upskilling the worker, workforce training, upskilling the worker. And I think that that's important. I think I would just say that I don't think we're having enough of a conversation about how we're upgrading the jobs and how we're actually ensuring that there are good jobs at the end of training available to workers where they can actually earn a decent living, have dignified work, take care of their families. To me, that's kind of a big gap in our thinking and our strategy around mobility.
One of the other things we haven't mentioned, I have to jump in, is the healthcare system. If you are wealthy, you're going to get the best healthcare in the world without any doubt. If you are at the bottom of the economic strata, you are not going to get great healthcare. And the result is you're going to miss time at work. You're going to have much higher degrees of obesity. Sadly, obesity is one of the reasons why our lifespan is not going up all that much. And drug addiction is another problem. Those problems are often at the lower economic strata, sadly. And with those kind of challenges, we're not going to see people rising up unless we give them better access and education about healthcare and better means to solve obesity and drug addiction problems.
Absolutely. And which is terrific. We've got a lot of big issues on the table. I want to try and hit a couple of different things. I want to talk about Aijen's last point, and then I also want to talk a little bit about David raised the issue of voting and also incarceration. I want to hit on those issues if I can. But going back to this, let's just call it the supply demand. I mean, we can train people, we can educate people, and I'm also going to be a champion for both 2-year and 4-year education, as well as certification and the benefits from different forms of post-secondary education. But at the end of the day, when people go out, what's on the other side waiting for them? And I'm thinking about this period of the pandemic and COVID job loss. Earlier, I know Aijen and at least also raised the issue of automation and technology. And David, I've read some things that you've commented on this, Robert, as well. And I'm wondering if you all can comment on what the job loss that we've seen over the course of the last year or so, what kinds of jobs are coming back, mixed with increasing automation, and again, what jobs are going to exist a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, and what that means to mobility, and how people are going to be able to increase mobility and an economy and a society where those forces are at work.
I would just start off by saying something I think we all, understand, but just to be clear, the programs that make that connection that Aijen is talking about, which is really important, that we've seen at AI in partnership with others that we've done reports out for scholars at Brookings and other places, are ones that combine the private sector, the employer, the community college, and the high schools, and develop a training program that is tailored to the job the employer has. And when that happens, the skills are upgraded and the quality of the job, the starting job, is significantly higher than a starting job would be if someone just came in directly from graduating from high school or just from the street. And I think that is an absolutely clear partnership that works. I think if you don't have the employer participation, you don't necessarily have the training that is really tailored to a job that exists and that is there. But you need the high school and you need the community college participating well. And you need to also say to young people that the only path to success is not a four-year college degree, that there are other paths to very high wage-paying jobs that lead to a flourishing family life, ability to own a home, but aren't necessarily dependent on graduating from a four-year college.
Just to speak to the part of the economy that I know the best, which is the care economy, looking at it, there, even before the pandemic, I think there was a lot of anxiety about the future of jobs and work and to what extent employment would be displaced by automation and artificial intelligence. And I have to say, I think especially post-pandemic, there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot that we do not know. But one thing we do know is that there is a growing aging population in this country that needs care, prefers to receive that care in the home and community. And we don't have a workforce in place to support it. These are jobs that can't be outsourced, won't be automated, at least until we develop an algorithm for empathy. We're gonna need human beings doing this work, and they earn an average of $18,000 per year. So we have really high rates of turnover because we lose even our very best, most dedicated care workers to other low-wage service professions like retail and fast food because they can earn a better living doing that work. This is one place, we know these are going to be a huge share of the jobs of the future. This is one place where we could really invest in these frontline healthcare workers, becoming a really crucial part of the healthcare team, having specializations in Alzheimer's and dementia care and all the different pieces that would actually enhance their ability to deliver a better quality of life and more support. We could raise the wages. This is the kind of thing that is actually in the Build Back Better Act. This investment in raising the wages and expanding access to these services is a huge part of the president's vision for Building Back Better. It's a huge leverage point. We know these jobs are here to stay. We can make them good jobs, and we can create the infrastructure that we need to support a growing aging population. Those, I think, are important, like to get really specific about where the leverage points are for us to actually improve the quality of work in this country, begin to eliminate poverty wage work in this country, and to also look to the future and anticipate what the future is where we do know the jobs will be.
I would just say, make a point of comment about the way in which the federal government responded to the COVID crisis and the extent to which an enormous amount of aid and assistance was put out during the really high point of the shutdowns or in the wake of the shutdowns. And it was emergency assistance, it was a lot, and it had an impact. I mean, the data that's coming out about both food insecurity and poverty is very positive in the impact of that assistance and that aid. So I would just point that out as a sign that our troubled democracy can sometimes respond to an emergency in a way that directs assistance to those, and David's absolutely right, who are far more hurt by the COVID crisis than those of us in higher income levels.
The government did a great job, but it's not enough, and it doesn't solve the problems of people that that lost their jobs. If we didn't have this government aid, it'd be much worse. But I don't think it solved the problem. I think people are falling behind.
Well, I think you're right about that. I don't disagree, but it is a question is whether we need to continue the kind of emergency direct transfer payments that cuts the states out, for instance, goes directly to individuals, and is not as tied to employment in a time when we're not in such an economic crisis. And that's a big question. And that's, I think, what Congress is going to decide, because a lot of what's in the big bill is a kind of answer to a real crisis that was caused by COVID. And the question is, are we going to get back to a normal time where that kind of emergency response and that kind of huge expansion of the federal government and increase of transfer payments to individuals is really the right way to go? Or is it a more local focus and a more focus on employment?
And Melody, I just need to weigh in there and say that that was the here and now problem, and I agree with Robert that the interventions certainly were needed. The urgent crisis now is the fact that our school children are a year behind in learning, and we have to, have a triage sense of urgency around those issues, or the kinds of things that are happening today are going to pay in multiples with these students who are, chronically behind for the rest of their work lives and civic lives. So we got to pull up, and really, I would say that's the immediate urgency we have now.
Yeah, there's so much on the table. I know we're not going to get to it, but I think the issues that, or at least not today, this is a conversation to be continued, but there's an issue at hand here, and correct me if I go off the rails, Aijen, but I think, Robert, you've put on the table, there was an emergency and the federal government rightly stepped in, but do we go back to normal times? And I think, Aijen, and going back to the quote that I read at the beginning, you're saying we need to rethink the way, I guess, what we are calling normal times. And I think that's one of the big debates that is aligned with the issue of mobility and how do we achieve mobility. We're saying we've got a common goal, but how do we go about doing it? I'm looking at the clock, and there are two things I want to try and touch on quickly. One, going back to Texas for a second, and the voting bill that was passed there, and thinking about mobility broadly, not just economic mobility, but the relationship between economic mobility and civic participation. I mean, their proponents of that legislation said, there was fraud, and we're trying to protect a free and fair voting. Opponents of the legislation said, no, there's de minimis fraud in our system. And in fact, people, in particular people of color, are going to be hurt by this legislation. And that is a debate. The legislation was focused on in Texas, but that's a debate that's taking place around the country. We saw what recently came out of Arizona. And Margaret, I'm just going to start with you, but others to jump in and ask you about the relationship between economic participation and economic mobility and civic participation, and how you think that legislation will play out in terms of the way Texans feel about their ability to engage in a conversation about mobility and decisions being made for and about them
Yeah, and I think, in the legislature, there's a real scorched earth now in that regard. Obviously, that bill, after you all read about it in the New York Times and everywhere else, after the walkout and the whatnot, then finally there was a quorum in place and that legislation has been enacted. I want people to know, and this is more true in Texas than it is in other places, see problem A, levels of educational attainment. But in a state of 29 million people where we have 21 million eligible voters, we have 16 million who are registered, 11 who voted in the last presidential, and importantly, about 2 million people who voted in each Republican and Democrat primary. So we have a state of 29 million people with 2 million Republicans in primaries carrying the day, if you will. And so issues around the interconnectedness of redistricting, the kinds of districts that are drawn, the activism on the left and right really are underneath all of this. So I think, Texans and probably the American people generally think, gosh, I've never heard anybody before this, recent past saying we needed to have 24-hour drive-through voting everywhere and always on one hand, and then others who, sort of these dog whistle issues around, the sanctity of the ballot and voter fraud and the steal and those sorts of things. I think, the truth is somewhere, most Texans really are somewhere very much in the middle, but it's become, sadly, another example of the fraying of our confidence in institutions and processes that we have to, restore through learning and other ways. I'm part of, with my former secretaries of education, an effort called READ, Roadmap to Educating for American Democracy. And I think people need to appreciate what is at stake here and all the parts of the puzzle that are underneath it, not just what happens in terms of an absentee ballot or the mechanics of a voting machine, but how those district lines are drawn, how we participate. Do we have enough participation? Our primaries as partisan, forums for surfacing officials and so on. So there's a lot to it, Melody, and I know we're going to get a chance to talk about some of those things over the coming months, and I'm looking forward to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
David,
on voting, in 1960, when John Kennedy was elected president, 90% of the population of this country was white. The population. The voting percentage of non-whites was less than 2 or 3%, certainly in the South. Very, very difficult for minorities in the South to vote. We've had enormous expansion of the franchise to people who are minorities, but now it has really, I think, in some parts of the South and other states, has upset some people who are in the establishment and are concerned they can't win some elections. And that's what's going on now. I'm surprised that it has gone as far as it has without people making it clear that it's really racist, in my view, what's going on. You're really trying to, I think, wipe out the ability of certain minorities to vote. And I think that is really going to tear asunder the democracy we have if we don't resolve this issue sometime soon.
I agree completely, David. And also just want to talk about the practical challenges here when you have, like the women that I work with every day, home care workers, for example, you don't have a day off on election day to vote. And you might have a young child at home who you're caring for, and you don't have childcare. And you are basically trying to make ends meet. So even the calculation around gas to get to and from the polls, all of these things are, when you are low income in a job where you have no job security, or paid time off, which is many, many jobs in this country that women of color hold. There's just a lot of practical challenges. And so when you start to do away with rights, early voting, vote by mail, other kinds of mechanisms that have expanded the ability to participate in our democratic process over time, it just makes it harder and harder for women like the women that I work with to vote, to engage.
I want to, I'm getting signs of the hook. So I want to ask one last question as we wrap up, because in part, this panel we talked about the American dream, we've talked about mobility, and also there's this issue of equity, which has become a larger part of the national conversation. More and more people are talking about issues of equity. And it raises questions about what's the source of the challenge, and also how do we go about solving some of the problems that we've talked about. It raises questions around individual responsibility and versus systemic and institutional challenges. And I'm wondering why you all believe, or if you believe, that this debate in and of itself has become so fraught. And whether or not you think equity plays a role in developing not only solutions, but sustainable solutions to some of the challenges that we've been talking about.
Melody, I just a thought. It has now seems to be a zero-sum proposition. For my neighbor to have more opportunity means I have to have less opportunity. I mean, I think it gets translated into, and in a time of high anxiety, and frankly, we just did a poll here in Texas where all Texans feel that Republican and Democrat alike were going in the wrong direction, that our legislature is majoring in the minors. And so I think at a time of high anxiety, introducing these notions that seem threatening or zero sum is part of our challenge here as we attempt to solve these critical issues that if we don't solve them, we're all in a world of hurt.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be the case that democracy meant some type of compromise so that everybody's views were more or less reflected and balanced. Today, we have a concept in our Congress and certainly in other states where you have to win 100% of what you want and you can't compromise or you're seen as weak. That is a real sad situation. And it's really, I think, tearing apart the bonds of our democracy to the extent that I've never seen it since the Civil War, where people just cannot compromise and they have to have 100% of what they want. And the people that are going to benefit from this are going to be the wealthy people. People that aren't going to benefit are people at the bottom of the economic and social strata.
You know, I agree with both of those remarks about the extent to which the extremes in both parties have torn us apart. I would just reflect on the Democratic primary for president the last time. When it came to Super Tuesday, the moderate candidates, Joe Biden and Michael Bloomberg, were up against more extreme positions from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And the vote was across the South, and a big chunk of that vote in the Democratic primary was African American. And those voters across the South in those communities came out overwhelmingly for the moderate, as Margaret might say, closer to the sensible center candidates. Bloomberg and Biden crushed Warren and Sanders. So I think that our people and our country is wiser than these extremes. And we just have to try to fight back against both of these extremes that are pulling us apart. And if we do that, I think the country will be with us.
I think that I don't believe that we are going to get to the kind of solutions that we need if we're truly serious about solving for the problems that we've addressed here or named here without very bold, courageous, and creative solutions, and without an equity approach at the center. And I wonder, absent a really strong equity approach, how much we've limited our ability to actually solve for some of these challenges. And my best analogy for this is my friend Franklin Leonard talked about the genius of the film Hidden Figures. Did you see that movie? Was really that you kind of walked away from the film wondering if these Black women working at NASA faced all of the structural, racial, and gender-based obstacles that they faced and still managed to take us to the moon, imagine if those obstacles didn't exist. Where would we be as a society? And what would be made possible, right? And I think that is not only will we not be able to solve for the challenges that we're talking about here in terms of mobility and the future of the American dream, but how much creativity and talent and brilliance is left on the table without actually, because of inequities that we haven't addressed and the fact that we haven't centered an equity approach.
Yeah, just how powerful, robust will we be as a society and as a country if everyone is ushered in and has the opportunity to fully participate, and we have the place to have those debates and with a shared sense of a common goal for that kind of opportunity and for that kind of economic and social mobility. And certainly this conversation, I think, has been terrific, along with Karen and Rashad's comments to kick us off in displaying different points of view, but everyone thinking, how do we try to get there, and how do we put our different forms of expertise on the table to be able to do that? And for that, I want to thank you all for being willing to participate in today's conversation. Hope you will come back to the University of Virginia and we can have you back in person the next time. But thank you so very much. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Melody, great to
Thank
be
you, Melody.
Great. Thank you so much.